Imagine for a moment being told that you are a god. Not that you serve a god, not that you speak for one, that you are one. That the blood in you is the blood of the sky, that you were in the world before you were born, and that when your body dies, you will not end, but simply go home, back to the stars, to take your place among the eternal ones who never set. Imagine being told this not as a story, but as the plain and settled fact of your life from the moment you can understand words. Imagine everyone around you believing it. Imagine an entire civilization, millions of people organizing their whole world around the certainty that you, personally, are the thing that holds the sun in the sky and the river in its banks. That was a pharaoh. That was what it meant to wear the double crown of Egypt. Not a king, as we understand a king. Something stranger and lonelier and heavier than that. We use the word so easily. Pharaoh, it conjures gold and mummies and a boy king's mask, a costume, a Halloween idea of a ruler. But behind the word was a real human being, or rather a long line of them, more than 170 of them across 3,000 years. And each one woke up every morning of his life knowing that he was believed to be a god and would be judged forever on whether he could carry it. Some of them were great, some of them were monsters, some of them were children who died before they understood any of it. Some ruled for 2/3 of a century and became legends in their own lifetimes. Some ruled for a few weeks and vanished so completely that we are not even sure they existed. But every one of them stepped into the same role, put on the same crowns, took up the same impossible burden, and tried, for as long as their body lasted, to be the thing that held the world together. Tonight one of them is going to let us watch. Tonight we are going to live inside that. We are going to find out what it was actually like to be the god on the throne, from the day he was born to the day they carried him out to the desert. How he was raised, what he wore, what he ate, what he feared, what was expected of him every single day, for the whole of his life, in a role that no human being could ever really have been big enough to fill. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the ancient world help you find some peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would like to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. And then let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and come with me back across the centuries, into a palace beside the great river, to meet the living God. Now, the first thing to understand, and it is the thing everything else grows out of, is that the Pharaoh was not the head of the religion. He was the religion, or at least its living center. In their way of seeing the world, everything depended on order. There was a word for it, and the word meant truth and justice and balance and the right way of things all at once. It was the principle that kept the sun rising and the seasons turning and the river flooding on time. It was the opposite of chaos, and chaos was always there, always pressing in from the edges, always waiting for a chance to pour back in and drown the world in darkness and disorder. And the one thing standing between the ordered world and the chaos was the king. His job, his actual cosmic function, was to hold that balance, to keep the order, to perform the rites that kept the gods content, to defeat the enemies who represented disorder, to make the offerings, to build the temples, to be the living link between the people and the divine. If he did his job, the sun rose and the crops grew, and the country was at peace. If he failed, if the throne was empty or the king was weak, then the fear was not merely political. The fear was that the world itself would come apart. That is a great deal to put on one person, and they put it on him from birth. So, let us begin there, with a birth. When a queen of Egypt was about to give birth to an heir, it was not treated as an ordinary human event, because it was not, in their eyes, an ordinary human event. It was the arrival of a god into the world, and they told a story about it, and they carved that story on the walls of their temples, and the story was always the same. It was said that the great god himself, the king of the gods, came down and took the form of the reigning pharaoh and went to the queen, and that the child conceived that night was his. So the heir was not merely the son of the king, he was the son of the god, carried in a mortal woman, divine from the first moment, and they carved the whole thing on the walls. the god speaking to the queen being led to the birth, the divine potter who shaped every human being on his wheel, shaping the royal child and his spirit, two little figures side by side, the body and the soul formed together, the birth itself attended by goddesses, the newborn being presented to the gods and held and blessed. A king was, quite literally, born on the wall of a temple as a god among gods, and there was a piece of him that was born alongside him and never left him. And it is one of the most interesting ideas they had about kingship. They believed that every person had a kind of spirit double, a life force that came into being with them and lived on after them. But the king's double was special. It was the royal spirit itself, the divine essence of kingship, and it did not belong to the man. It passed from king to king, down the whole long line, the same spirit inhabiting one body after another across 1,000 years, which meant that the man on the throne and the kingship he carried were not the same thing. The man was mortal. He was born, he aged, he died. But the thing inside him, the royal double, the divine office, was undying, and it simply moved on to the next body when the old one failed. When a king was shown embracing his own double, he was embracing the god that he carried, the immortal part, the crown-made spirit. So a pharaoh was, in a sense, two beings in one skin. A man, frightened and tired and mortal like any other, and a god, deathless, passed down from the beginning of the world, wearing him for a while and moving on. Imagine carrying that, knowing that the divine thing in you is not really yours, that you are only its current house, that it used your father before you and will use your son after you, and that your job is simply to hold it well for as long as your body lasts. And then, of course, he was also a small, wet, crying baby in a room in a palace, and somebody had to feed him and wash him and get up in the night with him. And that too is part of the truth, and we should not lose it. Because here is a thing that is easy to forget about these people. For all the divinity, for all the gold, they were a family. And the raising of a royal child was, underneath the ceremony, a human thing. He would have had a wet nurse, and the position of royal wet nurse was one of enormous honor, because the woman who suckled a god shared in a small way in his divinity. The children of the wet nurse became the milk siblings of the prince, raised alongside him, and they were bound to him for life, and some of them became his most trusted men when he came to the throne, because a king surrounded by strangers who wanted his power needed desperately a few people he had known since before he could walk. He was raised in a part of the palace set aside for the royal children, and there were many of them, because a king had a great wife, and he had other wives, and he had the women of the harem, and the harem was not what the word has come to mean to us. It was a whole institution, a community of royal women and their children and the staff who served them, with its own lands and its own workshops and its own economy. It produced fine cloth. It ran estates. The women in it were not idle ornaments. Many of them were powerful and some of them were dangerous, and we will come to that. And in that world of royal children, the little prince grew up. And it was a crowded, competitive, watchful world, because a king had many children, and only one of them could inherit, and the one who inherited was not always the eldest, and everyone knew it. The throne could pass to a younger son if the eldest died, and eldest sons did die all the time in a world without medicine. It could pass to the son of a lesser wife if the great wife had no son. It could be steered and shaped and fought over quietly for years in the corridors of the harem by mothers who each believed their own boy was the rightful heir. So a prince grew up being measured, watched, assessed. Was he strong? Was he clever? Was he pious? Did the court respect him? Did the army like him? A boy in that palace was never only a boy. He was a candidate, and he knew it, and his mother knew it, and his rivals knew it, and the great men of the court were already, while he was still small, deciding whom they would back. He learned to swim, and there are images of princes swimming, and it was a skill a king was expected to have. He learned to ride and to handle horses, and above all to drive a chariot, because the chariot was the great machine of that age, the tank and the sports car of the ancient world, and a king was expected to master it and to be seen mastering it. There are kings who boasted on stone, for all time, about how well they could shoot a bow from a moving chariot, how they could put an arrow clean through a thick copper target, how no one could match them. Some of that is boasting, But some of it is real. These were not soft men, most of them. They were trained from boyhood to hunt and to fight and to lead, because a pharaoh who could not do those things was a pharaoh whose throne was in danger, and the hunting was training for war. A prince was taken out into the desert to hunt the wild bull, the lion, the gazelle, the ostrich, and it was dangerous, and it was meant to be, because a boy who would one day have to stand in a chariot in the noise and terror of a battle needed to learn young how to be calm when a large animal was trying to kill him. There is a great king who left behind, carved in stone, the record of a single hunt in which he claimed to have brought down more than 100 wild bulls, and another who recorded his lions by the dozen. The numbers are boasts. The training behind them was not. He learned to read and to write, which was rare because almost nobody in that country could. And the ability to read the sacred writing was itself a kind of power. He was taught by the finest scribes. He learned the literature, the old wisdom texts, the instructions that fathers wrote for sons about how to live well and rule justly. And some of those texts survive, and they are full of shrewd, weary, practical advice about how to hold power and how not to lose it. Do not trust a man because he is close to you. Guard your tongue. A ruler is surrounded by people who will tell him what he wishes to hear. Be careful whom you raise up, for he may turn on you. That last one was not abstract. It was written in one famous case by a king who had survived an assassination attempt as advice to his son, and it is one of the most chilling documents from the whole of that world. A father telling his boy from bitter experience to trust no one because the people closest to you are the ones who can reach you with a knife. He learned mathematics and the measuring of land and the reckoning of the calendar. He learned the rituals, the endless complex rituals, because performing them correctly would be a central part of his working life. And in the great imperial ages, when Egypt ruled far beyond its borders and dealt as an equal with the other powers of the world, a prince might learn something of foreign tongues and foreign ways, because a king would one day have to receive ambassadors, read the letters of distant kings and marry, for the sake of alliance, the daughters of foreign rulers sent to him from far away. The palace of a great pharaoh held women from many lands, sent as brides to seal treaties, and their households and their languages and their gods came with them, so that the court of the living God was, in its way, one of the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. He grew up, in other words, being made, shaped deliberately from the raw material of a boy into the thing a king had to be. Every hour of his day was arranged. He was surrounded by tutors and priests and old soldiers and scribes, each of them pouring into him some piece of what he would need. He was rarely alone and rarely idle, and never, from the moment he could understand anything, allowed to forget what he was for. Some of them took to it. Some of them clearly loved the hunting and the chariots and the glory. And some of them, we can only guess, must have been crushed by it, must have lain awake as children in that palace, knowing what was coming, knowing that the whole world would one day rest on them, and wishing perhaps just once to be an ordinary boy in an ordinary house with an ordinary small life ahead of them. But that was never on offer, not for him, and he learned history, his own history, the long chain of kings stretching back behind him into the deep past, more than 1,000 years of them, and he learned that he was the newest link in that chain, and that the chain must not break, and that it was his job not to break it. Think about that weight on a child. Behind you 1,000 years of God-kings. Ahead of you, the whole future of the world, depending on you holding it together. And around you, a court full of ambitious men and a harem full of rival mothers, each of them wanting her own son on the throne instead of you. It was not a gentle childhood. It could not have been. And then, one day the old king died, and the world held its breath, because the death of a pharaoh was the most dangerous moment in the life of the kingdom. For a short and terrible time, the throne was empty. The link between the people and the gods was broken. The one who held back the chaos was gone, and the chaos, they believed, could feel it and was pressing in. The dead king had to be prepared for his own long journey, the 70 days of it, the salt in the linen and the golden mask, and we have spoken of that before. But the living could not wait 70 days for a king. The world could not be left without its center for that long. So the successor became king at once. The moment the old one died, even though the old one would not be buried for months. There was an overlap, a strange in-between time, when the old king lay in the embalmer's hands, and the new king already wore the crown. And it was the new king's sacred duty to bury his predecessor, to perform the final rites, to be the loyal son who sent his father safely into the West. And in the doing of it, his own kingship was made real. By burying the old god, he became the new one. And then came the crowning, and the crowning was extraordinary, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is where a man became a god in the eyes of the world. He was taken into the temple, into the presence of the gods, into rooms the ordinary people would never see. He was purified with water, poured over him by priests wearing the masks of gods, and that water was called the water of life, and it washed the last of the merely human from him. He was led before the great gods, and he was embraced by them, statue and king, god and god. And then he was crowned, and not with one crown but with several, because Egypt was not one land but two, and the king was the one who held them together. There was the white crown, tall and pale, the crown of the southern kingdom, the long, narrow valley of the upper river. And there was the red crown, flat and strange with its high back and its curling wire, the crown of the northern kingdom, the wide green marshy delta where the river spread out and met the sea. And the whole meaning of kingship was that one man wore both, that he united the two lands, that he was the Lord of the south and the Lord of the north, the joiner of the two kingdoms, and so they made a double crown. The white one nested inside the red one, and when he wore it he was, in a single object on his head, the whole of Egypt made one. There was the blue crown, worn in war and ceremony. There was the striped headcloth, the one you know from the golden mask, the everyday crown, simple and instantly royal. And on the brow of every crown, rising up, ready to strike, was the cobra, the spitting serpent, the eye of the sun, who would spit fire at the king's enemies. She reared up from his forehead, and she marked him, and she protected him, and no one but the king could wear her. And there were older, stranger rites bound up in the making of a king, rites that reached back to the very beginning of that civilization. There was a ceremony of the uniting of the two lands, in which the joining of the north and the south was acted out with chords and cymbals and the plants of the two kingdoms, the reed of the valley and the papyrus of the delta, knotted together around a sign that meant unity. There were processions in which the king walked or ran the boundaries of a sacred space, symbolically taking possession of the whole land, claiming it with his own feet. And there was the bull. In some of the oldest images of kingship, the king is a great wild bull, powerful, unstoppable, trampling his enemies, and a living bull was kept and honored as a god, and at certain moments the king was bound up with it. The strength of the animal and the strength of the king flowing together. To call a king a mighty bull was not an insult, and it was not only a metaphor, it was a statement about the raw, physical, life-giving power that a king was supposed to carry in his body. The same power that made the herds breed and the fields bear and the country live. So a king was many things at once: a god, a judge, a warrior, a bull, the sun's own son, the living knot that held the two lands together. All of it poured into him at the coronation, in rite after rite after rite, until the man who had walked into the temple walked out as something else. And he was given new names. This is a thing people rarely know. A pharaoh did not have one name. He had 5, a whole titulary taken at the coronation, and each one said something about what kind of king he intended to be, what god he favored, what he promised to do. His birth name was only one of the 5. The others were thrones and programs and prayers, and together they announced to the world and to the gods who this new king was going to be. And from that day he was not addressed by his name at all most of the time. He was addressed by a title, and the title meant simply the great house, the palace, the building. You did not speak the god's name lightly, so you spoke of the house he lived in, the way you might say the palace has decided, or the crown commands. And over the centuries that word for the great house became the word we use for the king himself. He had become the living God, the Lord of the two lands, the Son of the sun, the holder of the balance, the one thing standing between the world and the dark. He was, quite often, still a very young man, sometimes a boy, and now the whole thing rested on him. But he was almost never truly alone at the top, and there is one part of the picture that the word Pharaoh hides, and it is the women. Because behind and beside a great many of these kings stood royal women of enormous power, the king's mother above all. A queen mother, the woman who had borne the god, held a position that no one else could touch. She had raised him. She had protected him through the dangerous years. She had in many cases ruled the country in his name while he was still a child, and there are boy kings whose mothers governed the empire for years until their sons were old enough to take the reins and governed it well. And the great royal wife, the chief queen, was not a decoration either. She had titles of her own. She played a part in the great rituals. She stood beside the king as the female principal to his male, the two of them together, completing something that neither could complete alone. On temple walls she stands with him, at his scale sometimes, sharing in his divinity. And now and then, a woman took the throne outright and ruled as king, not as a queen but as a pharaoh in her own right, wearing the crowns, taking the 5 names, even shown wearing the false ceremonial beard, because the office was male and so the holder of it was shown as male, whatever her body was. There was a woman who ruled for 2 decades as one of the most successful kings the country ever had, who sent trading expeditions to distant lands, who built one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt, and who was so successful that the men who came after her tried, as they so often did, to chisel her out of the record. So the throne was a man's, in theory, but the power around it and sometimes on it was not only male, and any picture of a pharaoh that leaves out the mothers and the wives and the queens who ruled is only half a picture. Now, what did that actually mean, day to day? What did a god on a throne actually do? The answer is that he worked extraordinarily hard if he took it seriously, and many of them did. Because being the link between the people and the gods was not a symbolic position. It was a job with duties, and the duties were relentless. Every temple in the land, and there were hundreds of them, ran on a daily ritual, the washing and feeding and clothing of the god in his shrine, and in theory, the king was the only person who could perform that ritual, because he was the only one divine enough to stand before the gods as an equal. Obviously, he could not be in 1,000 temples at once, so priests stood in for him everywhere, acting as his deputies, but the right was always, in principle, his. Every offering laid before every god in every temple in Egypt, every single day, was being made, in theory, by the king. On the walls it is always the king offering, the king sensing, the king pouring, the king embracing the god. Thousands upon thousands of times, on wall after wall, it is his figure, because he was the one doing it, through his deputies forever. He was the highest judge, the final court. The law flowed from him because he was the source of order, and the hardest cases came to him, and his word could not be appealed. And this was not thought of as mere power. It was thought of as a duty, and a sacred one. The king existed, in their understanding, to protect the weak from the strong. That was the promise of kingship, repeated over and over in their writings. To defend the widow, to feed the hungry, to give justice to the one who had no one else to give it, to be a shelter, a shade against the heat, a rising of the waters for the whole land. A good king was not merely feared. A good king was the reason an ordinary person could sleep at night, knowing that above all the local officials and the powerful landowners and the men who might cheat them, there was at the very top a god who cared whether they were treated fairly. Whether any king truly lived up to that is another question. But it was the ideal, and it was written into the very idea of the office, and a king who ignored it, who let the powerful devour the weak, who let injustice spread, was failing not just politically but cosmically, because injustice was chaos, and holding back chaos was his entire reason to exist. And once he had reigned a long time, 30 years by tradition, he had to prove that he was still strong enough to hold it all up. There was a festival for this, an ancient one, older than almost anything else they did, a festival of renewal, and at the heart of it was a physical test. The king, who might by now be an old man, had to run. In front of the court, in front of the gods, along a marked course, he had to run a set path, sometimes carrying objects, to show with his own body that the divine energy was still in him, that he was still vigorous, still fit to reign. still able to make the river rise and the sun return. Think about that. A god king, perhaps 60 years old, perhaps 70, having to get up and run a course in public to prove he was not finished. Because the fear underneath everything was that a weak king meant a weak world, and a failing king meant a failing river. And the moment the people began to believe that the god on the throne was fading, the whole structure began to tremble. So they ran. And if they lived long enough, they did it again, and again, every few years. An aging man running to prove to the universe that he still held it together. He was the head of the army, the commander, and in the great warrior ages he was expected to lead it in person, to ride out at the front, to be seen fighting, because a king who won victories was a king who was keeping chaos at bay, and a king who stayed home while others fought was a king whose grip was slipping. There is a famous story a king told about himself, carved across the walls of temple after temple, about a great battle in the north against a powerful rival empire. In his own telling, he was ambushed, cut off, surrounded, his troops scattered and fleeing, his camp overrun, and he stood alone in his chariot, with only his God beside him. And he called out to that God, and he charged again and again into the massed ranks of the enemy, and drove them back into the river, and saved the day by his own hand. How much of that is true is another matter. The battle was, in reality, closer to a draw, and it ended years later in the first recorded peace treaty in history, a copy of which survives, in which two exhausted empires agreed to stop. But that is not how he told it. He told it as a triumph, and he told it enormous, because the point of a king in battle was not only to win, it was to be seen to embody the victory of order over chaos, of Egypt over the outer darkness. And so the story had to be told in the grand key, with the king alone against the world, and the world giving way before him. That was the image. Whether or not any single king lived up to it, that was what a pharaoh was supposed to be. The lone divine figure, larger than any army, holding back the dark by the strength of his own arm. He was the chief builder, and this mattered enormously to them. To build a temple, to raise an obelisk, to add a great gate to the house of a god, was one of the highest things a king could do. A gift to the gods that would stand for 1,000 years with his name on it. Kings competed across the centuries to build bigger and grander, to leave more stone behind, because stone was memory, and memory was a kind of immortality. There was one king above all who understood this, who reigned for an astonishing 66 years, who fathered so many children that he could not have known them all, and who built on a scale that has never been matched before or since. He put his name on more stone than any ruler in history. He raised temples up and down the whole length of the country, carved colossal statues of himself 60 feet high, and covered the walls with the story of his own greatness, over and over, until his name was so deep in the land that 3,000 years later it is still one of the first any of us learn. He even, in the habit of great kings, took the monuments of his predecessors and carved his own name over theirs, claiming their work as his. And he lived so long and reigned so long that he outlived his own heirs. Son after son, groomed to succeed him, grew old waiting and died before their father. The man who finally inherited the throne was one of his later sons, already elderly himself, who got only a few years of rule after a lifetime of waiting. The king had reigned so long that a whole generation grew up, lived and died knowing no other pharaoh, unable to imagine the sun rising on a world he was not in. That was the dream. To be so permanent, so woven into the stone and the memory of the land, that you became a fixed feature of the world itself, like the river, like the sun. And he was responsible, in a way we can barely imagine, for the weather, because the whole life of the country depended on the flood. Every year the river had to rise and spread across the fields and lay down its black mud, and if it rose too little there was famine, and if it rose too much there was ruin, and if it did not rise at all there was death on a scale that could bring down the kingdom. And the king was the one whose right relationship with the gods was supposed to make the flood come, correctly, on time, every year. Think about what that means. If the flood failed, it was, in some sense, his fault. His rights had not been right. His order had slipped. The gods were displeased with him. A bad flood was not just an agricultural disaster, it was a judgment on the king. That is a kind of pressure almost no ruler in history has ever carried. Not just responsibility for the economy or for war and peace, but responsibility for the rain, for the river, for the sun, for the holding together of reality itself. And to the ordinary people, he was almost unimaginably far away. Most Egyptians never saw the king, not once in their whole lives. He lived behind palace walls in a world they could not enter. And when he moved through the country, he moved in a golden barge or a curtained litter or a chariot behind a screen of guards. He was a rumor to most of them, a name, a figure on a distant temple wall, always giant, always calm, always crushing the enemies of Egypt under his sandal. And they worshipped him. That is the thing that is hard for us to feel from the inside. In their own homes, ordinary people kept little shrines, and on some of those shrines beside the household gods was the king. They prayed to him. They left him small offerings. A living man in a palace up the river was a god they prayed to for a good harvest and a healthy child, the way they prayed to the gods of the sky. He was as far above them as the sun and about as approachable, and that distance was not an accident. It was carefully built and carefully maintained because the whole system depended on it. A god who was too human, too visible, too ordinary was a god who could be doubted. So the king was kept remote, wrapped in ceremony, shown always at a scale larger than other men, his every appearance staged, so that the gap between him and everyone else could never quite be crossed. There were only a few days a year when that gap narrowed. The great festivals, when the god came out of his temple and the king appeared in public at a distance in glory. And even then what the people saw was not a man. It was the crown, the gold, the ritual, the living image of a god, performing being a god, in front of a crowd who had waited all year for the sight of him, and he carried it alone. That is the part I keep returning to. There was no one above him to appeal to, no one beside him as an equal, no one who could truly share the weight because there was only one God on the throne, and it was him. Rest there for a moment. Picture him at the end of a long day in his palace, the ceremonies done, the court withdrawn, the lamps burning low. A young man perhaps, not long crowned. Around him the painted walls and the gold and the servants waiting in the shadows. Above him, through a high window, the stars, the same stars he was told he would return to, and on him, invisible but always there, the whole weight of the world, the river and the sun and the order of all things, resting on his shoulders while he tries to sleep. There was nowhere for him to set it down. He would carry it every day, waking and sleeping, until the day he died and went back to the stars, and another god took his place and picked up the same weight and carried it on. And he did not do all of this alone in the practical sense, because no human being could have. Beneath the god on the throne there was a machine, a vast apparatus of government, and at the head of it stood one man, the highest official in the land, a kind of chief minister who ran the country day to day so that the king did not have to. That man held one of the hardest jobs in the ancient world. Every report came to him, every dispute that could not be settled lower down, the collection of the taxes which were paid in grain and cattle and cloth and labor since there was no money, the management of the granaries on which the survival of the whole country depended, the courts, the building projects, the apportioning of the floodwaters, the appointment of officials. It all passed through his hands, and there survives a text describing his duties, and it is exhausting merely to read, a description of a man who could never rest, who had to be perfectly fair, who was warned that everyone would be watching him and that he must lean neither toward the powerful nor against the weak. And below him, a whole pyramid of officials, governors of provinces, overseers of granaries and cattle and fields and the treasury, mayors of towns, scribes without number, the literate class, the clerks who actually ran the machinery, counting and recording and filing, because a state that size floated on an ocean of paperwork, written on reed paper and on flakes of stone. So the king sat at the top of a great structure, and much of the daily grind was carried by others, but nothing important was ever truly separate from him, because all of it was done in his name, by his authority, as an extension of his will. The vizier ruled for the king. The governor governed for the king. Every official, down to the humblest scribe counting sacks of grain in a dusty granary, was a limb of the god on the throne. He was the head, and a body cannot rest, even when the hands are doing the work, because it is still the head that answers for all of it. And here is the strange, quiet truth at the center of it, the thing I want you to carry into sleep tonight. For all the gold, for all the divinity, for all the millions who prayed to him, the man inside the crown was just a man. His body aged like any other. His teeth wore down and ached, because the bread of that country was full of grit from the grindstones, and even kings suffered agonies of the jaw. His joints stiffened. He grew fat or thin or ill. He loved his children and grieved when they died. He feared growing old. He feared being forgotten. He lay awake at night, sometimes we can be sure of it, as everyone does, and stared at the ceiling, and felt the ordinary human weight of being alive and mortal and afraid. And on top of all of that, the whole world. We have met him as an idea now, the living God, the Son of the Sun, the holder of the balance. Next, we are going to follow him through an actual day. We are going to wake him in his bed, and wash him, and dress him, and feed him, and walk with him through the palace and the court, through the audiences and the offerings and the hunt, all the way to nightfall, and see what the life of a god was actually made of, hour by hour. But not yet. For now, let him rest, the way he so rarely could. Let the palace be quiet. Let the river run dark and steady past the walls. Let the crown sit on its stand, and the weight of the world wait until morning. And let yourself grow heavy and slow and still, as the lamps burn down in the house of the god, and the stars turn overhead and the whole ancient kingdom sleeps. It is the darkest hour of the night, and the god is asleep. He lies in a bed raised up off the floor, in a room high in the palace where the air moves. The bed is low and elegant, its frame carved and gilded, its feet shaped like the paws of a lion, so that the whole thing is a lion carrying him through the night. There is no soft pillow under his head. There is a curved rest of wood or ivory beneath his neck, lifting his head off the bed, keeping it cool, keeping the crown of him raised even in sleep. Around the bed, the palace is not quite silent. Somewhere a guard shifts his weight. Somewhere a servant sleeps across a doorway. The lamps have burned down to a low glow. Through a high window, if he were awake to see it, the last stars are turning toward morning. And that neck rest deserves a word, because it seems strange to us. To sleep with your head on a curved piece of wood or ivory rather than a soft pillow. But there were reasons. It kept the head cool, lifted off the bedding, in a hot country where a soft pillow would have meant a sweating scalp. It kept the elaborate hair or the wig undisturbed. And it carried meaning too, as everything did, because to lift the head was to lift the seat of the person. And there were protective symbols carved on many of these rests, little gods who guarded the sleeper through the dangerous hours of the night, when the spirit was thought to wander and the dreaming self went out into other worlds. Even asleep, a king was watched over, propped up, protected, kept. And soon they will come to wake him. Because a god does not sleep in. The sun is coming, and the sun is his father, and the whole machinery of his day is about to begin. Tonight we are going to live one day inside that life, a single day of a pharaoh, from the moment they wake him in the dark to the moment the lamps go out again. What he wore, what he ate, who he saw, what he did with the hours. Not the idea of a king, the ordinary texture of a god's day. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the ancient world bring you a little peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe so the next one can reach you when you need it. And I would like to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, where in the world are you listening from and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below, and then settle back and let your breathing slow and come with me into the palace, into the last of the darkness, to wake the living God. Now, the palace itself is not what you were picturing, and this is worth getting right before we go any further. When we say palace, we think of stone, cold marble halls, great blocks, permanence. But the kings of Egypt did not live in stone. Stone was for the gods and for the dead. Temples were stone because the gods were forever. Tombs were stone because the dead were forever. But a king was a living man, and living men lived in houses. And the houses, even the greatest of them, even the palaces, were built of mud brick, beautiful mud brick. Do not picture a hut. Picture a sprawling, low, cool complex of painted buildings spreading out across a wide site with courtyards and gardens and pools and pillared halls, all of it made from the sun-dried mud of the river, plastered smooth and then painted. And painted gloriously. The floors of some royal palaces were painted to look like marshes, with pools full of fish, and ducks bursting up out of the reeds, and calves leaping through the papyrus, so that the king walked quite literally across a painted river teeming with life. The ceilings were painted with vines, or with a blue sky full of birds, or with the spiraling patterns they loved. The walls carried scenes of nature, of the hunt, of the family, of the bound enemies of Egypt painted on the very footstools and the very floor tiles, so that with every step the king trod on his foes. There were columns painted like great bundles of reeds. There were windows set high to catch the breeze and throw it down into the rooms. There were gardens with imported trees and rectangular pools where the royal family could sit in the shade by the water in the heat of the day. There were vast kitchens and workshops and storerooms and quarters for hundreds of servants and officials, and the harem with its own buildings and its own gardens and stables for the horses and the chariots. It was a small city in effect, a painted, garden-filled mud brick city built for one family, and at the center of it, in the cool high rooms, the god. And it was, by the standards of the ancient world, astonishingly comfortable. The great palaces had bathrooms, real ones, rooms set aside for washing, with a slab of stone to stand on, and a drain to carry the water away, where a servant would pour water over the king from a jar. They had lavatories, seats of limestone or wood over a container of sand. They had systems to move air, high windows and clever openings that caught the cool north wind and drew it down through the rooms, so that even in the killing heat of the summer, the inner chambers stayed bearable. The furniture was low and elegant, and beautifully made of fine imported wood inlaid with ivory and ebony and gold. Chairs and stools with legs carved like the legs of animals, chests and boxes for clothing and jewelry and cosmetics fitted with clever locks, lamps of oil, simple wicks floating in dishes of fat that filled the rooms at night with a soft moving light and a faint smell of burning. Braziers for the cold desert nights, because the desert is bitter after dark, even in summer. Woven mats on the floors and hangings on the walls, and everywhere color, because these were people who loved color and could not bear a bare surface. They had gardens above all. A great king's garden was a wonder, laid out in careful squares, with a rectangular pool at the center full of fish and lotus, and rows of trees for shade and for fruit, sycamore figs and date palms and pomegranates, and flower beds, and vines on trellises. In a country that was mostly desert, a green, watered garden was a piece of paradise, and the king had the finest, and to sit by that pool in the cool of the evening, in the shade, with the scent of the flowers and the sound of the water, was one of the great pleasures a human being of that age could have. And now, in the dark before dawn, they come to wake him. The waking of a king was not a small thing, and in the temples they told a version of it that turned it into a ritual, because the king's morning mirrored the morning of the gods. As the priests woke the god in his shrine at dawn, so the king was woken and washed and dressed and readied, and there was something sacred in it, because he was himself a god being prepared to meet the day. First the washing. Cleanliness to these people was close to holiness, and the king was the cleanest man in the kingdom. He was washed with water and rubbed with natron, the same salt that would one day be used to preserve his body, which cleansed and purified. His whole body was shaved, or kept shaved, smooth and hairless, because hair was impurity, and a god should be clean. Even the hair of his head was often kept shaved or cropped short, because he would not wear it bare anyway. He would wear a wig, or a crown, or the striped headcloth over a clean-shaved scalp. Then the oils. The dry heat of that country cracked the skin, and oil was not a luxury but a necessity, and the king's oils were the finest in the world, scented with rare resins and flowers, myrrh and lily and cinnamon and things carried from the ends of the earth at vast expense. He was anointed, rubbed with the sweet oils until his skin gleamed, and the scent of a king was part of his majesty. He smelled, quite deliberately, like a god, like incense, like the temple, unlike any ordinary sweating human being. Then the eyes. Both men and women in that country painted their eyes, and the king above all. A line of dark green or black, ground from mineral and mixed to a paste, drawn along the lids and extended out toward the temple, in that long, elegant shape we know from every image they left us. It was beautiful, and it was also practical, because it cut the glare of the fierce sun and helped keep flies and infection from the eyes. But on the king it was more than either. The eye, outlined so, was the eye of the sky god, the healed and whole eye, a symbol of protection and of wholeness, and to paint the king's eyes was to arm him with that. Then the clothing, fine linen, the finest in the world, woven so sheer and so white that it was spoken of as woven air. A pleated kilt, wrapped and folded with great care. A broad collar of gold and colored stone laid over the shoulders and chest, wide and heavy, blazing with color, bracelets, armlets, rings, a ceremonial beard sometimes bound on, long and squared and plaited, the beard of a god, worn by kings whether or not they could grow one, because the divine ancestors were shown with it, and so the king wore it too, and the crown, or the headcloth, chosen for the day and its duties. And on the brow, always the cobra, rearing up ready to spit fire at his enemies. By the time they were done, the tired human being who had woken in the dark with a rest of ivory under his neck had been transformed piece by piece into the shining image of a god. That was the point of all of it. Every morning, a man was rebuilt into a pharaoh, and only then was he ready to be seen. And the sandals went on last, and even they carried meaning. The soles of a king's sandals were sometimes painted or worked with the images of the bound enemies of Egypt, the foreign foes, the forces of chaos, so that with every single step all day long the king was treading his enemies underfoot, crushing disorder beneath his feet as he walked. Even the act of walking was made into a statement of what a king was for. Everything, you see, was meaning. Nothing about a king was allowed to be merely practical. The linen was cleanliness and purity. The gold was the flesh of the gods, which was said to be made of gold. The eye paint was the healed eye of the sky. The cobra was the fire of the sun. The beard was the mark of the divine ancestors. The sandals were the crushing of chaos. He could not put on a single item without putting on a piece of the cosmos. To dress a king was to assemble a god, layer by layer, symbol by symbol, every morning of his life. Rest there a moment, in the cool of the early morning, in that high-painted room with the first grey light coming in at the window. The quiet movements of the servants, the scent of the oils, the soft weight of the linen and the gold being laid on piece by piece. There is a strange peace in it, in being tended so completely, in being made ready with such care. Let your own shoulders soften. Let yourself be still in the hush before the day, while the god is dressed and the sun comes up over the river. Now the first duty of the day, and it came before anything else, was to the sun, because the sun was rising, and the sun was his father, and the most important thing a king did, the thing on which everything else depended, was to greet it, to be present at the moment the light came back into the world, to perform the rites that welcomed the sun, that helped it rise, that joined the king to the great daily miracle of the darkness ending and the day being born. In some reigns this was done at a special altar open to the sky. The king would go out or up to a high open place, as the eastern sky went from black to grey to that deep soft blue and then to gold. And he would raise his arms as the disk broke the horizon, and he would make the offering and speak the words. And the light would come up over the desert and touch him first, the sun greeting the Father, the God on earth greeting the God in the sky. Think about beginning every single day that way, not with a list of tasks, with the sunrise and the belief that your presence at it mattered, that you were part of the machinery that brought the light back, that if you did this right, the world would go on. And it was not thought of as a small ceremony, casually done. It was the hinge of everything. To them, the sun did not simply rise by nature. Every night the sun died and traveled through the darkness of the underworld and fought its way through terrors and had to be reborn at dawn, and nothing about that was guaranteed. The dawn was a victory, one fresh each morning against the forces of darkness, and the king was on the side of the light, part of the effort, part of the great daily triumph of order over chaos. When he raised his arms to the rising sun, he was not admiring a view. He was taking his place in the oldest battle there is, and helping in his person to win it one more time. And so his day began not with himself but with the cosmos, and that set the frame for everything that followed. He was not a man getting up to go to work. He was a god taking up, again, the endless task of holding the world together, and the first act of it before food, before business, before anything, was to stand and greet his father as the light came back into the world. Then the offerings in the temples, or rather the king's part in them, performed by him where he was and by his priests everywhere else. The god in every shrine in the land being washed and dressed and fed at the start of the day, and all of it, in principle, the king's own act. And then at last the business of ruling. He ate at some point in the morning, and the food of a king was the food of a god. We know a great deal about what they ate, because they buried it with their dead and painted it on their walls, and left the records of the temple offerings, which were, in the end, royal food. Bread of many kinds, dozens of kinds, from coarse loaves to fine pale cakes sweetened with dates and honey. Beer thick and mildly alcoholic, more like a liquid bread than the beer we know, drunk by everyone from the poorest laborer to the king, though the king's was the finest. Wine for the wealthy and the royal, red and white, from the vineyards of the Delta, stored in jars labeled with the year and the vineyard and the maker, so that a king could call for a good vintage the way a rich man does today. Meat, which the poor ate rarely and the king ate whenever he liked. Beef from cattle raised and fattened for the table, ducks and geese roasted, wild fowl from the marshes, fish from the river, though there were some fish the priests and the pure avoided, not pork generally among the royal and the priestly, who held the pig to be unclean. And fruit and vegetables in abundance, because the black land was rich. Onions and garlic and leeks, beans and lentils and chickpeas, lettuce which they associated with fertility, cucumbers, melons, dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, honey, the only sweetener gathered from hives and prized, nuts, herbs and spices, some of them carried from far away, and behind that table stood an army. To feed a king and his court and his household was itself a vast operation. The royal kitchens were enormous and they never rested. There were bakeries turning out bread by the hundreds of loaves in dozens of shapes, some of them molded into figures and animals. There were breweries because beer was food and everyone drank it, the children too, a thick, nourishing brew that was safer than the river water. There were men whose whole lives were spent slaughtering and butchering cattle for the royal table, and men who kept the birds, and men who fished, and men who tended the hives, and men who pressed the oil, and men who trod the grapes and sealed the wine jars, and wrote the labels. There were tasters too in some reigns, for a king had enemies, and poison was a fear, and a man might be employed simply to eat first and prove the food was safe. And there were the servers, ranks of them, who carried the dishes and knelt to present them and never met the god's eye. A single royal meal set in motion the labor of dozens of people, most of whom would never be allowed near the man they fed. It was a rich table, a varied table, a table most of the ancient world would have wept to see. And the king sat at the very top of it, with the finest of everything, the best cuts, the sweetest fruit, the oldest wine, served on vessels of gold and silver and fine painted ware, by servants who knelt. And yet, and this is one of the small human truths the bodies tell us, it did not make them healthy in the way you might think. Their bread wore their teeth down to agony, because the flour was full of grit from the grinding stones and the wind-blown sand, and even kings died with abscesses in their jaws that must have caused them constant pain. Their rich diet, heavy in bread and beer and honey and fat, left some of them overweight with the diseases that come from that. The mummies of some great kings show hardened arteries, worn joints, bad teeth, all the ailments of rich men who ate too well and moved too little in their later years. The god at the golden table suffered from his teeth like anyone else. There is something oddly comforting in that. And when he suffered, he had the finest doctors in the world, or at least the finest that world had. And that is a story worth pausing on, because Egyptian medicine was famous across the whole ancient Near East, and kings of other lands wrote to Egypt asking to borrow its physicians. The royal doctors were learned men, trained in the house of life attached to the temples, and they worked from written manuals, some of which survive. And those manuals are a strange mixture of genuine, careful observation and pure magic, sitting side by side, because to them there was no clear line between the two. On the one hand, real medicine. They set broken bones and splintered them. They stitched wounds. They knew a great deal about the body from the long practice of embalming. They had a whole catalogue of injuries, described case by case, with the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment laid out in order, and some of it is sober and shrewd and would not be entirely out of place today. They dressed wounds with honey, which we now know actually fights infection. They used willow, which contains the thing that aspirin is made from, for pain. They had a vast knowledge of the plants of their land and what each could do, and on the other hand, spells, because they believed that sickness could be caused by hostile spirits, by the dead, by curses. And so the treatment for a fever or a pain might be a real drug and a spoken incantation together, the medicine to fight the illness in the body and the words to fight the enemy behind it. A doctor and a magician were often the same man, and nobody saw a contradiction in it. The king had the best of all of this. And it still was not enough, in the end, because their medicine, for all its learning, could not touch most of what actually kills people. And the mummies of the great kings show us exactly what they died with: worn and abscessed teeth, hardened arteries, arthritis, old injuries, the parasites that lived in the river and the water and worked away at the body for a lifetime. A god could command the finest physicians on earth and still grow old and still hurt, and still, in the end, die of the ordinary things that everyone died of. Now the heart of the working day was the audience, and this is where the machinery of a kingdom actually turned. The king would take his place in a great pillared hall, or on a raised throne beneath a canopy, or in a special window of appearances that looked down into a courtyard, a balcony from which he could show himself and hand down rewards. And there, the business of the state came to him. The vizier came the chief minister, with his reports, the endless reports on the granaries and the taxes and the flood and the courts and the building projects. Officials came to be appointed or dismissed or rewarded. Governors came from the provinces. Foreign envoys came from the other great powers of the world and from the small kings of the client states, bringing tribute and letters and requests, and they would prostrate themselves, faces to the ground before the living God, and present the gifts of their masters. And what gifts? The records of tribute read like the inventory of a dragon's hoard. Gold by the ring and the bar, silver, copper, precious stones, exotic woods, ivory, ebony, leopard skins, live animals, monkeys and hunting dogs, and on great occasions, more extraordinary creatures still, a giraffe, a bear, brought from far away as a wonder for the god. Slaves, fine cloth, horses, chariots, weapons, everything the world had that was rare and costly flowed, in tribute and in trade, toward the throne of Egypt, because Egypt was the richest kingdom on earth, and the king sat at the center of the wealth like a spider at the center of a web of gold. And the letters. In the great imperial age, the king of Egypt was one of a small handful of great kings who between them ruled the known world. And they wrote to one another, and their letters survive baked on clay, and they are astonishing to read. The kings of the other great powers addressed the king of Egypt as brother, because they were equals, the small club of the truly mighty, and they wrote to him about gold, endlessly about gold, because everyone believed that in Egypt gold was as common as dust. "Send me gold," they wrote, "in great quantity, for you have much and I have need. Send more than your father sent. My messenger you kept too long, send him home. The last gold you sent was not pure, weigh it again." And they haggled over marriages, sending their daughters to the Egyptian king and asking for his in return, and dickering over the bride price like merchants. One great king complaining that another had sent lavish gifts for a bride, and the Egyptian had sent too little. It is oddly human, this correspondence of god-kings. Beneath the grand titles, it is men asking each other for money, complaining about slow messengers, worrying over the fine print of a marriage, sending each other doctors and craftsmen and complaints. The god on the throne of Egypt, when he sat down to deal with his fellow kings, was doing something not so very different from what powerful men have always done: managing relationships, trading favors, keeping the peace, counting the gold. At the window of appearances, the king rewarded his loyal servants, and this was a great honor, one of the greatest a man could receive. The king would lean out and shower down upon a deserving official collars of gold, thrown down to him, heavy golden collars, the gold of honor, and the man would gather them up and wear them with enormous pride, and have himself depicted receiving them on the walls of his own tomb, because to be given gold by the god with his own hand was a thing to boast of for eternity. And there was judgment. The hardest cases, the appeals, the matters too great for the lower courts came before the king, and his word was final, and the whole weight of Mayat, of truth and justice, was supposed to speak through him. A good king took this seriously. To give true judgment, to protect the weak from the strong, was the very heart of what a king was for, and the volume of it was staggering, because a kingdom of millions generated an endless river of business. And though the vizier and the officials handled most of it, the threads all ran in the end back to the throne. Decisions about the great building projects, which quarries to open, which temples to raise, where the labor would come from. Decisions about the army, the campaigns, the garrisons on the frontiers. Appointments, because every high office was the king's to give, and every appointment was a piece of patronage, a way of binding a powerful man closer or lifting a loyal one up. The management of the flood and the harvest and the granaries, on which the survival of everyone depended. The receiving of reports from every corner of the land, carried by messengers, read out by scribes requiring answers. A conscientious king could fill every waking hour with it and never reach the bottom. And a lazy or a weak or a distracted king who let it pile up, who let the powerful help themselves, who let injustice spread and the frontiers slip and the granaries empty, was a king under whom the whole vast delicate machine began, slowly, to fail. The difference between a good reign and a bad one was, in large part, simply whether the man on the throne did the work. Let yourself rest in the middle of that great hall for a moment, the painted pillars rising around you, the light falling in shafts from the high windows, the murmur of officials, the gleam of gold as a collar is thrown down, the envoys bowing, the scribes writing, the whole rich business of a great kingdom flowing quietly toward one seated figure beneath a canopy. It is vast, and it is orderly, and it turns hour after hour around him. Now not every day was audiences and offerings. A king had other lives, and not every day was spent in the same place, because a king moved, and when a king moved, he moved on the river. The river was the road of Egypt, the great highway running the whole length of the land, and the king traveled it in a floating palace. The royal barge was one of the most magnificent things in the kingdom. A great vessel with a cabin like a shrine, gilded, painted, hung with fine cloth, with a crew of rowers and a great steering oar, and it carried the god up and down his country in a slow procession of gold on the water. And when the royal barge passed, the country came out to see it, because for most people this was the only glimpse of the god they would ever get, the distant gleam of the golden cabin sliding by on the brown water, the flash of the sun on the gilding, the sound of the rowers, the banners. They would come down to the banks and press their faces to the ground as the living god went past. Carried on the river, his own right rule was supposed to keep flowing. He moved for many reasons: to visit the great temples for their festivals, to show himself in the different regions of his land, because a king unseen was a king half forgotten, to inspect building works, to move between palaces, for the kings had more than one in different cities, and shifted between them through the year. And in the great old days, the whole court would move with him, a floating town of officials and servants and soldiers and women, the entire apparatus of government loaded onto boats and carried up the river behind the golden barge of the god. Imagine watching that go by, the long line of vessels on the wide river in the sun, the gold at the head of it, the whole power of the richest kingdom on earth afloat, moving slowly past your village, close enough to see and impossibly far above you all at once. And one of a king's other lives was the hunt. To go out into the desert or into the marshes and to kill was to display the king's strength, his courage, his role as the one who subdues the wild and the chaotic. And it was, we can be fairly sure, something many of them truly loved, a release from the endless ceremony, a few hours of speed and danger and open air. The king would stand in a light reed boat, poled quietly through the papyrus, and with a throwing stick, he would bring down the wild fowl that exploded up out of the reeds, sometimes with his family around him. His wife steadying herself against his leg, a child crouched at his feet, a hunting cat retrieving from the water. It is one of the loveliest scenes they painted, over and over, this royal family day out in the marshes among the birds and the fish, and it was pleasure, and it was also a picture of the king bringing order and life out of the teeming wild. In the desert, it was bigger and more dangerous. Gazelle and wild cattle and ostrich, hunted from a chariot at speed, the king driving with the reins tied around his waist and both hands free for the bow. And the greatest and most royal quarry of all, the lion. To hunt lions was the sport of kings, because the lion was the king of beasts, and for the king of men to master it was a statement about the order of the world. There was a great king who recorded, on scarabs sent out across his whole kingdom like little press releases, that he had personally killed more than 100 lions in the first years of his reign. Whether the number is exact or not, the message was clear. The God on the throne is a hunter of lions, a subduer of the wild, a keeper of order even against the fiercest thing in creation. And a hunt like that was not a quiet affair either. It was an expedition. Beaters went ahead to drive the game. Attendants followed with spare chariots and spare bows and spare horses. There were men to carry water, and men to carry the kill, and huntsmen who knew the ground and the animals. Sometimes a whole area of desert was enclosed with nets and fences, and the game driven into it, so that the king could hunt in a controlled space without the danger of losing his quarry or himself in the open waste. Everything was arranged so that the god could perform the role of the mighty hunter with the least real risk, though real risk remained, because a cornered lion or a wounded wild bull does not care whose sandals are painted with enemies. And when it was done, the king came back with the kill, and it was recorded, and it was carved on walls, and it became another line in the endless story of the king as the one who masters the wild, who stands between the ordered world and the chaos of the desert, and who wins. And then the evening came, and the light softened and went golden and then red over the desert, and the day's duties eased. But before the evening, a word about the women of the palace, because they were a part of a king's life that the paintings on the temple walls almost never show, and yet they filled a whole quarter of the palace and a whole side of his existence. A king had one great royal wife, his chief queen, who ranked above all the others, and whose son would usually be the heir. But he had other wives besides, and beyond them the women of the harem, and the harem was a great institution with its own buildings, its own gardens, its own lands, and its own busy working life. Do not picture idleness. The harem was a place of work as much as anything. The women there wove cloth, and it was famous cloth, some of the finest linen in the kingdom, and they ran the estates that supported them, and they raised the royal children, their own and others, and they trained the young. There were dozens of women in a great king's harem, sometimes more, and among them were foreign princesses, sent from distant kingdoms as brides to seal treaties of friendship, so that the household of the god held women who had traveled from the ends of the known world, with their own attendants and their own tongues and their own gods, living out their lives in a palace far from home, married to a man they might rarely see. It was a world of women and children and servants, humming with its own life, its own rivalries, its own loves and jealousies and ambitions. And it was, as we will see when we come to the shadow side of kingship, a place where dangerous things could grow, because every mother in it wanted the throne for her own son, and a woman with a son and a grievance and access to the king was a woman who could, in the wrong circumstances, become the center of a plot. But by day, for the most part, it simply lived. Women weaving in the shade, children running in the gardens, the looms working, the estates turning their profit, a whole quiet economy of cloth and children and royal women, tucked into one wing of the great painted city, part of the machinery of the god's life. The evening was for the family, perhaps, and for pleasure. There might be a feast, and the feasts of the Egyptian rich were famous, and the kings were the greatest of all. Long tables loaded with food, wine flowing, guests seated on fine chairs with garlands of flowers around their necks and cones of scented fat set on their heads, which melted slowly through the evening and released their perfume. And music, always music. Harps and lutes and lyres and flutes and drums, singers and dancers, girls turning and leaping to the clap of hands and the shake of the sistrum, the whole warm, sensuous pleasure of a great house at night in a warm country. And at these feasts, in the middle of the wine and the music and the flowers, they liked to be reminded that it would end. A singer would sing what we would call a harper's song, and some of those songs survive, and they are hauntingly beautiful and strange to hear in the middle of a party. Make the most of the day, they say. Follow your heart while you live. Put myrrh on your head and fine linen on your body. Do not weary yourself, for no one can take their goods with them, and no one who has gone has ever come back. Enjoy the day, and do not tire of enjoying it. There is a phrase in one of them that people still quote. It tells the guests, in effect, to enjoy the good things, because the day is short and death is long. And you can imagine it, the harp playing softly, the wine warm in the cup, the flowers wilting on the guests' necks, and a voice singing gently that all of this will pass, and that this is exactly why it is precious. Even at a feast, even in a palace, even the god at the head of the table was reminded that his days were counted and that only the moment was truly his, or the evening might be quiet. The king with his wife, in the cool of the garden by the pool, in the last of the light. The children brought to him. A game played on a board, the game of passing, where counters moved across squares according to the throw of the sticks. A game they loved and buried with their dead, so they could play it in eternity. The scent of the garden, the sound of the water, the ordinary sweetness of a family at the end of a day, which even a god could have for an hour before the crown came back. And then, at last, the lamps burned low and the palace grew quiet, and the god was undressed piece by piece, the gold lifted off, the collar, the rings, the crown set on its stand. The linen removed, and the tired mortal man inside the god, lay down again on the lion-footed bed and set his neck on the curved rest of ivory and closed his eyes. Above him, through the high window, the stars turned, the same stars he had greeted at dawn from the other side, the same stars he was told he would return to when his body failed and his long journey began. The river ran dark and steady past the painted walls. The guards kept their watch. The harem slept and the children slept and the officials slept in their houses across the sleeping city. And out beyond the walls, the whole black land slept, the farmers in their villages, the whole kingdom that believed this one sleeping man was the thing that held their world together. And he slept. For a few hours in the dark, he was not a god. He was only a man, breathing slowly, dreaming whatever kings dream, at rest, until the darkest hour before dawn, when they would come again quietly to wake him, because the sun was coming, and the sun was his father, and it would all begin again. That was a day in the life of a pharaoh, the waking and the washing and the oils and the gold. The sunrise greeted, the gods fed, the kingdom governed, the enemies of order subdued, the family loved, the lamps put out. A life of unimaginable wealth and unimaginable weight, lived in painted rooms beside a great river, 3,000 years ago and more. We have woken him and dressed him and followed him through his day and put him to bed. Next, we are going to face the thing that stood behind every day of it, the shadow the crown could never quite escape, the plots, the rivals, the fear, the growing old, and the death that every god on that throne had to prepare for, obsessively from the moment he was crowned, because a god, it turned out, could die like anyone else. We will go into the harem again, but this time into the dark of it, to a real conspiracy, a plot to murder a king in his own palace hatched by his own women, and to the trial that followed, which was written down and survives, and which is one of the most extraordinary documents from the whole ancient world. We will watch a great king grow old and feel his body fail and know that the thing he had been all his life was slipping away. And we will follow all of them, in the end, to the one destination no pharaoh could avoid. The reason for the mummies and the tombs and the golden masks, the long journey into the West. But not yet. For now, let him sleep. in the cool of the palace, with the stars turning overhead and the river running on in the dark. Let the crown rest on its stand. Let the great house be quiet, and let yourself grow heavy and slow and still and sleep, the way the god is sleeping, for a few peaceful hours before the sun comes. Every day of a pharaoh's life was lived in the light. The gold, the crowds, the ceremony, the sun greeted at dawn. But there was a shadow that lay behind all of it, and no king ever fully escaped it. And tonight, we are going to walk into that shadow gently and out the other side. Because for all that he was called a god, the man on the throne could be betrayed. He could grow old and feeble. He could be murdered. And in the end, without exception, he had to die. And the whole shining apparatus of his life, we will find, was in some deep way a preparation for that single fact which no gold and no divinity could ever change. This is the last of our 3 journeys into the life of the living God. We have met him as an idea and followed him through a day. Now we go with him into the dark, the plots against him, the fear he lived with, the slow defeat of his own body, and the long journey west that every one of them in the end had to make. But before we begin, if these quiet walks through the ancient world bring you some peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe so the next one can reach you when you need it. And I would like to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, where in the world are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. And then let your breathing slow and settle back, and come with me one last time into the palace beside the great river, into the shadow behind the throne. Now, the first thing in the shadow is fear, and the fear was not foolish, because the danger was real. A god on a throne is still a man with a back, and a back can hold a knife. The very thing that made him powerful, that everything flowed to him, that his word was final, that his death would change everything, also made him a target. Because if you wanted power in that world, there was one person standing in your way, and he was mortal, and he slept at night like anyone else. And this is the deep loneliness at the center of the whole life we have been describing. He was surrounded always by more people than almost anyone alive. Servants, officials, priests, guards, wives, children, courtiers, an entire city of people organized around him. And yet he could trust almost none of them completely, because almost every one of them wanted something from him, and some of them wanted his place. The wisdom texts hammer this home again and again. Do not fill your heart with a brother. Know no friend. Make no intimate. Trust no one. Even the man who eats your bread may raise himself against you. A king was told, from boyhood, that the price of the throne was that he could never fully lower his guard with another human being, because the closer someone was allowed to come, the more dangerous they became. Think about that as a way to live, to be a god, worshipped by millions, and to be, at the same time, unable to trust the people who dressed you and fed you and slept beside you. To have everything, and to be, in the deepest sense, alone. And the danger, very often, came from inside, not from foreign enemies, not from armies, from the palace itself, from the people closest to him, from the harem. We talked in our last journey about the harem as a place of women and children and weaving and quiet estates. And most of the time that is what it was. But it was also something else. It was a nest of mothers, each with a son, and each son a possible king, and the throne could only go to one of them. And a woman who believed her son had been passed over, who watched another boy given the crown that she thought should be her own child's, was a woman with the deepest motive there is, and she lived inside the palace, and she had access to the king. And in one case we know exactly what happened, because they wrote it all down and the record survives, and it is one of the most extraordinary documents to come out of the ancient world. There was a great king, old by now, who had reigned for a long time and built enormously and ruled well. And in his harem was a secondary wife, not the chief queen, who had a son, and she wanted that son on the throne, and he was not the heir, and she decided to change that by killing the king. And it was not a wild impulse of one desperate woman. It was a conspiracy. It was organized. She drew in others, many others, officials of the harem, Faye butler, members of the household, even it seems some of the military, and men connected to the world outside the palace. They planned to kill the king and to raise a rebellion at the same moment, so that when the old god fell, her son would be swept onto the throne in the chaos. And they used, among other things, magic. This is one of the strange details. Among the accused were people charged with making wax figures, images, to be smuggled into the palace, to work spells that would weaken the guards and protect the plotters, because to them magic was a weapon like any other, as real as a blade. They had even, it seems, got hold of a book, a secret book of spells from the royal library itself, a book of the king's own magic, stolen and turned against him, used to make the wax figures and the words of power that were meant to open a path through the palace to the sleeping god. Think about that. They stole the king's own magic to kill the king. The very power that was supposed to protect him was turned in the dark into the weapon against him, and the plot reached wide. When the trial came, the list of the accused was long, and it ran through every part of the palace world, officials of the harem and their deputies, the overseer of the treasury, a butler, army officers, and men who could carry word to troops outside, wives of the men at the gates drawn in to pass messages, some of the king's own trusted household. It was not a single desperate act. It was a web, patiently spun, reaching from the women's quarters out into the army and the administration, all of it aimed at one night, one death, one empty throne that a certain mother meant to fill with her son, and they made their attempt. And here is the thing that hangs over the whole document, the question it does not quite answer. Did it work? For a long time nobody was sure. The records tell us there was a plot and a trial, but they are cagey about whether the king actually died in it. He may have survived the attempt and ordered the trial himself, or he may have died, and the trial been held in the name of the son who succeeded him, the rightful heir, the one the plotters had tried to push aside. And then, in our own time, they examined the king's mummy, and they looked at the throat, and the throat had been cut, deep, all the way across, to the bone, a wound that would have killed him instantly, hidden for 3,000 years under the wrappings and under a collar the embalmers had placed just so. They killed him. The plot succeeded, at least in that. They cut the old god's throat in his own palace, but they did not win. The rebellion failed. The rightful heir took the throne, and he hunted the plotters down, and he put them on trial, and the record of that trial is what survives. Panel after panel of the accused, the harem officials, the butler, the military men, the women, named, tried, condemned, and the punishments were terrible. Many were sentenced to death. Some were allowed as a mercy of rank to take their own lives rather than be executed. And the judges themselves, some of them, were caught up in it because during the trial, a few of the men appointed to judge the case were found to have been carousing with the accused women, and they too were punished, mutilated, made an example of. It is all there. A murdered king. A mother who loved her son too much and wanted a throne for him. A web of servants and soldiers and wax dolls and whispered plans, and at the center of it, an old man, a living god, dead on the floor of his own house, killed by the people who lived closest to him. And there is a detail in that trial record that tells you how these people thought, and it is chilling in a quiet way. The accused, when they were written down, were not always given their real names. Some of them were recorded under false names, names invented for the document, and the invented names were curses. One was written down as a name meaning, roughly, the one whom the sun god hates. Another as a name meaning, he who brings blindness upon himself. Because a name to them was a real thing, a piece of a person that carried power and that lived on after death. And so to write a traitor into the eternal record under a cursed name was itself a punishment, a way of damning him forever, of making sure that for all time his name would carry his shame. They did not merely execute the plotters, they rewrote their names into curses, so that eternity itself would spit on them. That is how seriously they took a name, that is how real the written word was to them, and it is the same instinct, exactly. That made them so desperate to preserve their own names, carved deep and everywhere, because to be named well was to live, and to be named ill, or not named at all, was a kind of death worse than dying. That was the fear every pharaoh carried. That was why the wisdom texts told princes to trust no one. That was why one king wrote to his son, from bitter experience, that he had been attacked in the night by the very people he had fed and raised and favored. The higher you sat, the more people wanted your place, and the closest of them could reach you in your sleep. Rest a moment, but not in the fear. Step back from it. Because the remarkable thing is not that it happened, but that it was so rare. Across 3,000 years and 170 kings, the plots we know of are few. Most pharaohs lived out their reigns and died in their beds. The system held, far more often than it broke. But the fear was always there, in the quiet of the palace at night, and it was not foolish, and every king knew it. Now the second thing in the shadow is gentler and sadder, and it came for almost all of them who lived long enough. Growing old. Because a pharaoh was supposed to be the mighty bull, the hunter of lions, the athlete who ran the festival course to prove his vigor, the young perfect god crushing his enemies. That was the image, carved on every wall, ageless and strong forever. And the man inside the image got old. We can see it, because we have their bodies. We can see the great king who ruled for 66 years, and who was by the end an old man. His mummy shows him with worn and abscessed teeth that must have caused him constant agony. His arteries were hardened, his joints were ruined with arthritis. He had a curved and painful spine. He was, in his last years, a frail, aching, half-crippled old man, and yet on the temple walls, right to the end, he is a beautiful young warrior in the prime of life, driving his chariot, drawing his bow. Think about that gap. The god on the wall is 25 and perfect. The god in the palace is 90, in pain, his teeth rotting in his head, being helped to walk. And everyone must go on pretending, because the whole order of the world depends on the strength of the king, and a king who is visibly failing is a crack in the universe, and they reached for whatever help they could get. There is a letter that survives, sent between kings, in which the aging ruler of Egypt, sick and in pain, wrote to a friendly foreign king and asked him to send help. Not soldiers, not gold, a statue, a healing goddess, a famous divine image from that foreign land with a reputation for curing the sick. And the old Egyptian king asked for it to be sent to him, across the world, in the hope that a foreign god might do what his own doctors could not, and ease his suffering and make him well again. Imagine the state of a man who would do that. The son of the sun, the living god of the greatest kingdom on earth, with the finest physicians of his age at his bedside, writing to a distant land to beg for a foreign statue, because he was in pain and nothing was working, and he was frightened, and he wanted, like any sick old man, simply to feel better. All the divinity in the world, and in the end he was just a suffering human being, hoping that somewhere, somehow, there was a cure. That is why they had the running festival, the renewal, where the aging king had to prove his vigor. But you cannot renew a body forever. The teeth still ache, the joints still fail, the eyes dim, and somewhere in there, the man who had been told his whole life that he was a god, the son of the sun, the holder of the balance, had to lie awake and feel his own divinity leaking out of him one ailment at a time, and know that the thing he had always been was ending. And here is the cruelty of it, particular to them. An ordinary old man in that world could look forward to rest to the west to the field of reeds, but a king's death was not only his own, it was a crisis for the whole kingdom. The moment he died, the balance broke, the throne stood empty, the chaos pressed in. His dying was not a private thing, it was the most dangerous event in the life of the state. So even his decline was watched and weighed and feared, and he could not simply be an old man growing tired. He had to be the failing god whose failing threatened the world. There is no gentle way to carry that, and they carried it, one after another, for 3,000 years. And there was one more torment in growing old, and it was the question of who would follow. Because a king who lived long enough saw his own heirs die before him. The great king who reigned 66 years outlived son after son after son, boys and men groomed from birth to succeed him, each one dying while the old father lived on. Imagine that. To bury your own chosen heir, and then the next, and then the next, and to keep on living and reigning, while the young men who were supposed to replace you go down into the west ahead of you, one after another. And every death of an heir was not only a private grief, it was a political tremor. because an unclear succession was an invitation to exactly the kind of plot we have just seen. The moment it was not certain who would follow, the harem stirred, the factions formed, the ambitious began to calculate. A king growing old without a clear, strong, living heir was a king whose final years were shadowed by the knowledge that his death might bring chaos, that the thing he had spent his life holding together might come apart the moment he let go. So old age for a pharaoh was not rest. It was the failing of the body, and the burying of heirs, and the gathering of shadows, and the knowledge that his own ending was the kingdom's greatest danger. He had been the guarantee of order all his life, and now his own decline was becoming a source of disorder. And there was nothing he could do about it but grow older and weaker and wait. Now the third thing in the shadow is the greatest, and it is the one everything else has been leading toward, death, and the preparation for it. Because here is the truth that sits under the whole of Egyptian civilization, under the pyramids and the temples and the gold. They were, more than almost any people who ever lived, preparing to die, not morbidly, not in despair, but constantly, carefully from a position of hope. And no one prepared more or more obsessively than the king. A pharaoh began building his tomb almost as soon as he was crowned. Think about that. A young man, newly made a god, at the start of what he hopes will be a long reign. And one of the very first things he does is begin work on the place where his body will lie. Every year of his life the work went on, deep in the rock of the valley, or rising in stone above the desert. His whole reign, his tomb grew alongside him waiting, and a whole community existed to build it. In the great age of the hidden tombs, there was a village out in the desert, walled apart from the world, where the men who cut and painted the royal tombs lived with their families, generation after generation. They were not slaves. They were skilled craftsmen, the finest in the land, and they were paid in grain and fish and oil and cloth, and they had names, and we know many of them, because they were literate and they wrote constantly on flakes of stone and broken pottery, and those scraps survived. And what they wrote is astonishingly ordinary. Records of who came to work and who did not and why. This man was absent because he was brewing beer. This one because he was building his house. This one was ill. This one was, in the plain words of the record, with his wife. They wrote letters and complaints and love poems and laundry lists and rude jokes about each other. They borrowed tools and did not return them. They argued with their foreman. They were the people who actually built eternity, and their lives were as small and warm and human as anyone's. And once, when their wages of grain were late, they did something no one is recorded as ever having done before. They stopped working. They sat down in the desert at the temples and refused to move until they were paid. It is the first recorded strike in human history, and it happened at the doorstep of the machinery of a god-king's immortality, carried out by the very men building it, because the bread had not come. And it was not a grim task to them, this building of the tomb. It was the most important building a king would ever do, more important than any temple, because this was the machine that would carry him from this life into the next. The whole enormous apparatus we have spoken of in these journeys, the 70 days of embalming, the salt and the linen and the golden mask, the 4 jars with their guardian heads, the coffins nested one inside another, the tomb furnished like a house with food and furniture, and games and little servants, the walls painted with the journey of the night, the spells written out to carry the soul through the gates, the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth. All of it, all of that vast machinery was aimed at one thing, getting the king safely from the throne to the stars, because a king's afterlife was the grandest of all. An ordinary person hoped for the field of reeds, but a king, the son of the sun, hoped for something greater. He would join the sun in its eternal circuit, riding the great boat through the sky by day and through the underworld by night, forever. Or he would climb into the northern sky and become one of the stars that never set, the imperishable ones, wheeling slowly around the pole, undying, night after night, for all time. The pyramid itself was a machine for that ascent, its shape the shape of the sun's rays coming down, a ramp of stone for a dead king to climb into the heavens. And the oldest spells of that whole civilization, the very first religious writings carved anywhere, were written for exactly this, carved on the walls of the burial chambers inside the pyramids, to lift the dead king up into the sky. They are strange and beautiful and fierce. Those spells, they command the sky to open. They tell the clouds to darken and the earth to quake as the king comes forth, because a god is ascending and the world must make way. They tell the dead king that he does not die, that death has no power over him, that he flies up, that he is a bird, that he is a star, that a ramp is built for him to the sky so that he may climb to the gods. They call on the sun to take the king by the hand and lead him into the horizon. Read them now and they are still astonishing. 4,500 years later, this fierce refusal to accept that a person simply ends. You do not die. You will not die. You climb. You rise. You take your place among the stars, and you shine there forever, and the darkness never touches you again. That is what they carved on the inside of a mountain of stone. In the dark, for a dead man to read on his way up to heaven. So death for a pharaoh was not the end of his divinity. It was the fulfillment of it. In life, he was a god trapped in a failing human body, carrying the whole weight of the world. In death, he set the weight down at last and shed the failing body, and became fully and finally what he had always been said to be. He went home, back to the sun, back to the stars, back among the eternal gods where he belonged. And I think when you understand that, the whole thing changes. All that obsessive preparation for death was not fear. It was hope. It was the deepest hope there is, dressed in gold and carved in stone. The belief that the ones we lose are not lost, that they only go before us, that death is a door and not a wall, that beyond it there is light and family and a river that never runs dry, and for a king the stars themselves. So let us follow him one last time on that final journey. Rest here first gently before we go, because this is not a frightening place we are going to. It is, in the end, the most hopeful place in the whole of their world. We have walked with the Pharaoh through everything now. The divine birth on the temple wall, the watched and measured childhood, the crowns and the 5 names and the weight of the world coming down onto young shoulders, the sun greeted at every dawn, the kingdom governed, the gods fed, the enemies subdued, the gold and the linen and the oils and the feasts, the fear in the dark, the knife in the harem, the slow failing of the body, the burying of heirs, the reaching for a foreign statue to ease the pain. And it all comes at last to this, to a crossing, to a journey west into the light beyond the light. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing frightening here. There is only the oldest hope there is, that death is a door, and that on the other side of it there is home. The old king dies, in his bed, or by the knife, or worn out by the years. The god on the throne breathes out for the last time, and the most feared moment in the life of the kingdom arrives. The balance is broken. The world holds its breath, and at once the great machine begins. The heir becomes king in the same instant, so the throne is never truly empty, so the chaos gets no opening. And the body of the old god is carried to the embalmers, and the 70 days begin. The washing, the removal of the soft parts that would not keep each set in its jar. The heart left in the chest for the weighing to come. The salt, and the 40 days of stillness under it, drawing out all the water of life. The anointing with sweet oils, the wrapping layer upon layer of fine linen, with the amulets laid in among the folds, and over the heart the little charm carved as a beetle, carrying its quiet prayer, and over the face the mask made in his likeness, so that his wandering soul would know its own body and come home. There is something to sit with there, quietly. The most powerful man in the world, the living God, the one before whom whole nations pressed their faces to the ground, ends in the same hands as everyone else, laid on a table, washed by strangers, his body opened, dried, wrapped, exactly as a nobleman's would be, exactly as in its humbler way a poor man's was by the sand. Death is the great leveler, and even a pharaoh at the end is a body on a table being made ready, tended by quiet men who have done this 100 times before. The gold was greater, the mask was finer, the tomb was vaster. But the fact was the same. He died, and was prepared, and was carried to the west, like every human being who has ever lived in that long green valley beside the river, and like every human being who has ever lived anywhere at all. And through all of it, the priests worked, and one of them wore the long black head of the jackal god, and became, in the sacred moments, the god himself, bending over the body of the king as the god had bent over the first body at the beginning of the world. And when the 70 days were done, they carried him out to the west, across the river from the land of the living on the east bank where the sun rose, to the land of the dead on the west bank where the sun set. In a great procession, the coffin drawn on a sledge, and behind it everything he would need, the furniture and the food and the treasure and the little servants and the mourners and the priests and the new king, his heir, walking behind to perform the final rites, to be the loyal son who sends his father home. It was the greatest funeral the world could stage, and the whole country knew it was happening. The procession wound down to the river, and the coffin was placed on a great barge, and it crossed the water, the same crossing the sun made every evening, from the living side to the dead side, and on the far bank it was taken up again and carried toward the mountains. The mourning women walked behind, their arms raised, dust in their hair, wailing the loss of the god. The priests burned incense and spoke the words. The oxen strained at the sledge, and the treasure came behind in a long glittering line. Everything a god would need for eternity, carried out into the desert in the sun for the last time before it went down into the dark. And at the door of the tomb they stood the coffin upright, and touched the tools to its mouth and its eyes, and gave the dead king back his breath and his sight and his voice, so that he could live again in the world beyond. And then they carried him down, into the rock, into the painted chamber where the whole journey of the night was written on the walls to guide him, and they laid him in his nested coffins inside the great stone box, and they left him there with everything love and power could give him, and they came up again into the light and sealed the door and stamped the wet clay with the seal of the necropolis. And there is a silence in that moment that I want you to feel. The last of the living climb the passage back toward the daylight. Their footsteps fade. The lamps go out one by one, and then the door is closed, and the seal is pressed, and the noise of the world is shut out, and inside, in the total dark, the king is alone at last, alone with the gold, alone with the painted walls and their maps of the night, alone with the food that will never be eaten, and the little servants standing in their rows and the coffins wrapped around him like closed hands. The most surrounded man in the world, who could never in his life be truly alone, is finally, completely alone, in the dark, in the silence, at the start of the only journey he ever had to make by himself. And that was the whole point of everything. All the gold and the spells and the mask and the tomb were there so that he would not be alone on that journey after all, so that the words on the walls would guide him, so that the gods would meet him, so that the jackal-headed one would take his hand in the hall of judgment and lead him in, so that his heart would balance against the feather, and the door beyond would open, and he would step through into the light, and be met, and be home, and never be alone again. And they went back across the river, to the land of the living, and left the king alone in the dark, to begin his climb toward the stars. And that, in the end, was the life of a pharaoh. It began with a divine birth carved on a temple wall, and it ended with a sealed door in a silent valley. And in between there was the gold and the weight, and the sun greeted at dawn, and the kingdom governed, and the enemies subdued, and the fear in the night, and the slow defeat of the body, and the long hope of the stars. They were gods, and they were men, and they were both at once, and the being both was the whole of it. The divinity that lifted them so high, and the mortality that they could never, for all their gold, escape. And not all of them were good, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise, so let me say it before we reach the end. Some of them were cruel. Some were vain beyond reason, covering the land in images of themselves. Some were weak, and let the kingdom slide, and let the powerful prey on the poor that they were supposed to protect. Some clawed their way to the throne over the bodies of rivals. There were reigns of famine and misrule and collapse, ages when the whole structure broke down, when the tombs were robbed by the very officials meant to guard them, when the country split and starved and turned on itself. The pharaoh was supposed to be the guarantee of order and justice, and a great many of them failed at it, some through weakness, some through cruelty, some through simple bad luck in a hard world. That was the shadow side of the office itself. So much depended on one man that a bad man, or a weak one, or an unlucky one, could bring suffering on a scale that is hard to imagine. The same system that could give a great king the power to build wonders and feed millions could give a poor one the power to let millions starve. To make one human being the living center of the world is to gamble the world on what kind of human being he turns out to be. And they knew it. That is what the ideal of Mahat was for, the endless insistence that a king must be just, must protect the weak, must feed the hungry, must give true judgment. It was a standard held up in front of every king, precisely because everyone understood how much harm a king who ignored it could do. The ideal was so loud because the danger was so real. And now, let me tell you the strangest thing, the thing that ties all three of our journeys together, and then I will let you sleep. They wanted above everything to last, to be remembered, to have the body preserved, the name spoken, the tomb inviolate, the journey completed, the ascent to the stars achieved. That was the point of all of it, the pyramids and the temples and the tombs and the gold, not to be forgotten, to go on. And most of them were robbed. Their tombs were broken into, often within a generation, the gold stripped away, the bodies torn from their coffins. Their monuments were taken by later kings and carved with other names. Some of them were erased on purpose, chiseled out of the record by enemies and successors. The great machine of their immortality failed again and again, almost every time. And yet, here we are, speaking of them. 3,000 years later, on the other side of the world, in a language they never knew, saying their titles, telling their days, walking with them from the cradle to the tomb. The child learns the word Pharaoh before almost any other word from the ancient world. Their golden faces are the most looked at objects on the earth. Their names, the ones that survived, are spoken every single day, in every country, forever. And even their broken bodies have found a strange kind of the immortality they wanted. The great kings whose tombs were robbed, whose mummies were torn from their coffins, were gathered up in the end by loyal priests and hidden away, and they slept in secret for 3,000 years, and then they were found. And now they lie in a museum in a great hall built for them, tended and guarded and studied more carefully than any priest ever tended them, their faces still recognizable, their features still their own. You can stand before the actual face of the king who ruled 66 years, the mighty builder, and look at his nose and his jaw and the set of his mouth, and he is there, still, preserved, exactly as he wished to be, 4,000 years after he greeted his last sunrise. They wanted the body kept. It is kept. They wanted the face known. It is known. They wanted the name spoken. It is spoken tonight by me and heard by you, wherever in the world you are. They did not get the afterlife they built for. The tombs were robbed and the bodies broken and the gold melted down, but the deeper thing they wanted, to not be forgotten, to go on, to have their names live in the mouths of the living, that they got, beyond anything they could have dreamed. A civilization that has been dust for 2,000 years is still, tonight, the thing we cannot stop thinking about. The gods on their thrones are still remembered, still spoken of, still here. So let them rest now. Let the palaces lie under the sand, their painted floors and their gardens and their pools long gone back to dust. Let the valley be quiet and hot and still under the pyramid-shaped mountain, the sealed doors in the rock, the painted chambers in the dark. Let the great temples stand empty in the moonlight, the forests of stone columns, the obelisks with their gold long stripped away still pointing at the sky. Let the kings sleep, all of them, the great and the terrible, the builders and the children, the ones who ruled for 60 years and the ones who ruled for a season and vanished. Let them lie in the west where they wanted to lie, their long journey done, their weight set down at last. They carried the world on their backs for as long as their bodies lasted. They greeted the sun every dawn and fed the gods every day and held the balance against the chaos with everything they had. And they were afraid, and they grew old, and they died, like everyone, like all of us. And they hoped, with a hope so vast they built mountains to hold it, that death was not the end, that they would go home to the stars, that they would see their loved ones again beside a river that never runs dry. There is nothing left for them to carry now, nothing left to hold up. The sun rises without them the way it always did, the way it always will. and it does not need them anymore. And there is a kind of peace in that, the peace of a weight finally laid down. For all their gold, they were only human. That is the thing to carry into sleep tonight, and it is not a sad thing. It is a gentle one. They were people. They woke and were afraid and loved their children and lost them and grew old and hurt and hoped. They were told they were gods, and they carried it as best they could. And in the end they lay down like everyone lies down, and the river ran on without them, the way it runs on without all of us, and they are at rest. That is the last and truest thing. Whatever they were in life, great or terrible, mighty or weak, they have been at peace now for 3,000 years, and nothing troubles them anymore. And the only thing that has come down to us across all that time in the end is not their power and not their fear, but simply their names, and the quiet fact that they lived. So close your eyes now. Let the crown rest on its stand. Let the great house be quiet. Let the river run on in the dark, the way it has run through all of this, through every king and every dynasty and every age, carrying its water north to the sea. And sleep, the way they are sleeping, in the west, under the stars, their long day over at last, their names still spoken softly somewhere in the world at this very moment, and at every moment forever. The morning always comes, and it always finds the gold first, and the kings sleep on, in the quiet, in the dark, at rest.